is Katie.
Yeah, we're talking about the Chairman's Award. So basically, to give you a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about tonight, we're going to go over the purpose of the Chairman's Award as a whole, why you might want to complete it. We're going to talk about how it's important to individual teams, like some other things you might get out of it. You're going to learn our perspective on how the award works. So there's no like one way to do the Chairman's Award. So a lot of what we're sharing is going to be insight that we've gained from our time submitting. But it's just our perspective, and you should take it with a grain of salt, I guess. And then we definitely do want to have a discussion, especially at the end. So be sure to share your questions with us, and we'll do our best to answer them.
And just really quick for some background, I have been a chairman's presenter for 2 years, and I've been on the chairman's team for this is my 3rd year. So that's sort of my background in the area.
Yeah, I've been on the chairman's team for 3 years as well, and I'm the lead this year. Is this? Yeah. You were doing this one, yeah? Really? Okay. So, so preparing the submission. So we start our submission process really, really early. Like we started in, I think, October or September. Because we started really early because we tried to have all of the parts of the submission done pretty soon so we can get review from other people and they have plenty of time to look at it. And also starting early gives us a lot of time to take care to measure our outreach properly, to get all the data we need and identify the points ahead of time so we're not scrambling at the last second to count up numbers of students or film videos of interesting moments. When you're preparing the submission, because the chairman's submission is limited in a lot of ways in terms of whether it be characters or minutes or the number of questions you can ask reasonably within the room, you really want to consider which parts of your outreach are the most impactful and be sure to highlight them the most. Generally, we find we have a couple of standout programs that we really want to shine the brightest limelight on. We want to identify the most important programs and make sure we have all the data we need to back it up and give full evidence on why our program is impactful and why we are deserving of a Chairman's Award. So ways that we do this is with this giant spreadsheet called Citrus by the Numbers. So basically it's stored in this spreadsheet somewhere. So that could be the number of teams in our youth program, the number of weeks of a summer camp that we run, the number of people who attend a demo. It's all stored there. So we can find any data point that we need from this spreadsheet and put it into our essay or executive summary, whenever we want. And we don't have to spend time asking this person and that person, do you remember what happened? It's all shared. This also helps us identify the media we need to collect, especially for your video and sometimes your prop. You need good photos and video of your outreach in action because it's not just you saying something, you have videos of other people engaging in your outreach and showing your team's presence in the community. So that's why starting early is definitely helpful because it really makes it clear what you need to look for ahead of time.
Yeah, so this is a little bit about our submission time. And like Libby said, we want to start as early as possible, not only so that we can sort of nail down what we want to talk about, but also because we found that it's really, really useful to not just keep it contained within your team, and to actually send it out to other teams that you know have good outreach programs, have won chairmans before, or just who you trust and think know your program well enough to sort of give you good feedback. We send our essay out usually in November to a couple other teams to sort of read over, make comments on. Our 2018 season, which was our first season that we won the Chairman's Award at a regional, we sent out our essay and we were super proud of it, and we got it back, and all of the comments were like, I like this, but maybe you should change this. And reading through, we realized, oh no, we need to completely change this if we want to send it in. And I strongly believe that those changes and sending it out and getting that feedback was one of the reasons that we won the Chairman's Award that year. So getting feedback from other teams is a really, really helpful tool, and you need to start early if you want to do that, to give them as much time as possible to do you the favor of reading over your submission. So there's no, so we want to leave as much time as possible for the presentation. The best thing about the presentation is that the deadline is when you're at that first competition giving your presentation. So you have up until then to sort of work out wording, work out what you want to do for it, and make changes along the way. That really helps because it makes it much more flexible. Because you have to turn in your executive summary and essay in February, any outreach that you do from like February to March isn't going to be in there, especially if it's something you didn't see coming. So the presentation can be a great place to highlight that stuff that didn't make it into the essay because you just didn't know it was going to happen or it hadn't happened yet. Yeah, so making sure that beforehand, when you're going through this planning phase that Livy talked about a little bit earlier, making sure that you have a very set out schedule for what you want to do is really, really helpful because you can then check yourself against that schedule, say, okay, we thought that we were going to have a draft of all of our executive summary questions done by now, and we haven't even started them, so we need to get on that. Just like if people have build season schedules or building robot schedules, same sort of thing, you want to have something to check yourself against so that you can so that when you're doing that, often, once a week, twice a week, you can sort of make sure that, I'm not missing these little deadlines because, those little deadlines pile up very fast to the February 6th deadline this year. And, if you get to mid-January and realize you haven't started your presentation yet, or you haven't started, a final draft of your essay, that can be pretty problematic, especially because that's the midst of build season and nobody wants to be working, full-time on chairmans for that.
Yeah, and just one thing to quickly add, our team has a practice of submitting our essay and executive summary to STIMS a couple of days early because we found it's famously difficult to format in STIMS and we want to make sure everything goes smoothly and it's not like the deadline, like 12 p.m. is approaching and your essay is still not in. It's like, oh my gosh, you want to have a couple of extra days just in case the worst happens. All right, so now we're going to get into sort of structuring your submission. Wait, this was my slide, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, wait, was it?
Yeah.
Okay, so what we start with in our submission planning process is identifying the core ideas and or the theme of our whole submission. So we actually regard these two things as slightly separate. So what we find is the core idea is sort of the simplest answer to why are you a role model team, or one basic core idea that you can highlight throughout your entire submission. To give you an example, our core idea is usually something related to our motto, which is educate, empower, excel. So it's a really simple phrase and a simple idea that you can apply to all of your submission. In contrast, the way we think of theme is slightly different. And we think of theme as sort of a method of presenting your information. So your theme could be like trees and like growth and how, your team is a tree and the apples that grow on it are your outreach programs. That's what we would think of as a theme. Not to, like, the way sort of we sometimes describe it is like a gimmick or just a method of presenting your core ideas. So we think of them kind of separately. And so your theme is sort of like the outward appearance and the core idea is what you want the judges to remember about your team. So yeah, just like I mentioned, how is my team a role model team? This is the question you always want to be answering about the chairman's submission, because winning the chairman's award means that to FIRST, you are a role model team and you embody the entire spirit of FIRST and what every team should strive to accomplish. So you need to identify what about our team proves that we are a role model team who is deserving of the chairman's award. The other questions you want to answer are, what do you want the judges to remember about your team? So you don't have a lot of time to interact with the judges. You have 12 minutes in the room, and hopefully they read your essay and executive summary, and that's all you get. So you really want to think about what do we want to stand out the most, because they probably won't remember everything. And so you need to figure out what is the most important thing that we're always coming back to, that they think when they're talking in the judging room about which team they think should win chairman. They're going to say, oh yeah, 1678, they educate, empower, and excel. And they might remember a couple of your programs. And that's the reasoning they use to say why you should win. Yeah. All right. So just to go over the different parts of the submission, we're going to start with the essay, which has a 10,000 character limit. So short, it's really sad. We think of the essay as sort of the bones of our submission. This is where we can have both quantitative information, data points, and qualitative information, like stories and sometimes quotes, all combined together because it's a pretty big document, even with the limit. So the essay is sort of the core structure of every major program that our team participates in and runs. The structure of the essay, recently we've been moving towards shorter paragraphs rather than longer paragraphs, because we find that as our team grows and we find more outreach programs, it's best to fit as many as possible into the essay. We used to write our essays like an English essay with our beautiful intro paragraph, our topic sentences, 5 sentences of support, maybe a quote thrown in there, and our conclusion sentence. And then we move on to the next paragraph and boom, like 2,000 characters are gone. And then we really realized there was almost no information in there because everything was just like fluff, kind of. We want to get straight to the data. We want to get to the impact. The impact is really what you're trying to convey in every single word of your essay. So just like I mentioned, your essay should be full of evidence. So types of evidence you can use, quotes are great. Asking for quotes is great. If, say, you've been working with a team really closely and you really feel like you've been helping them out a lot, you can ask for a quote from a student who was really involved in that, who has a really good idea of what your team's contributed. You can give numbers. Numbers are always awesome. You should be collecting numbers for pretty much everything you do. Number of attendees at an event, number of teams you started, number of tools you've lent out at a competition even. Because every single number is like undeniable proof that you've done something. Sometimes we find that we are struggling for content, whether it be in the essay or executive summary. And so sometimes this comes from not being aware of some of the outreach that we've done in the past, but we also have sometimes realized there are some things that you wouldn't really consider always when you're creating your submission that are still very relevant to the Chairman's Award. So some of the things we forget to put in our submission are like media appearances and newspaper articles, some things that you wouldn't really consider an outreach program, but that still prove to the Chairman's Award judges that you are a role model team, you're present in your community. One thing that's also really, really important in Chairman's is the importance of sponsors. So there are 2 really major awards in FIRST for if you're like a role model team, like those really high up awards that come right at the end of award ceremonies, and that's the Chairman's Award and Engineering Inspiration Award. And so they're both very, very similar, but the key difference between Chairman's and Engineering Inspiration is your sponsors. So in Chairman's, you really need to take care to mention your sponsors and what you do for your sponsors, because part of FIRST is making FIRST known to large corporations, and it's important that you mention your sponsors so that you don't fall into the category of an EI winner rather than a Chairman's winner.
Just as a side note there, one thing that FIRST judges and Chairman's judges especially really like to see is you working with your sponsors. So not just, like they give you money and maybe you give them a t-shirt and like a high five. That's great for, sponsoring your team monetarily, but they want to see you working with your sponsors on outreach programs. So something that we've started doing in the past couple of years is reaching out to our sponsors to develop some of our key programs and then marketing that back into Chairman's as, not only are we, not only do we have a financial relationship with, this university, this company, et cetera, but we're also working with them to develop community outreach. And FIRST really likes to hear that because we, as a FIRST team, are working with sponsors, working with big names, and working with them to help help your community or help, an international community, whatever you're working on or whatever you're working with your sponsor on. It shows collaboration, which is really good. They like to hear that. And it shows, that you are reaching out to your sponsors in a way that isn't just asking for money.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. And then the last thing I'm going to go over for the essay is the 10,000 character limit. Your awareness of that should come closer to the end. You don't want to start cutting down characters out of your essay until you have everything on the page that you could possibly think of putting in your essay. Because if you start cutting down before you finish writing, you might leave things out that maybe would have had a great place in your essay. So I know of some teams that have their essay starts at 20,000 characters and then they work from there. Usually ours is a little bit below that, but you want to have everything on the page before you start cutting down so you can see what doesn't fit in or what can we move to the executive summary of the presentation. And then just like we've been mentioning a couple of times, you want a lot of outside reviewers and you also want different types of outside reviewers. So you want some people from FRC, maybe some ex-judges if you're lucky, but you also might want some people who are not involved with FRC or have a very basic level of knowledge of it, because sometimes the judges are not very aware of how FRC works. So you want to make sure your essay or your whole submission is understandable to maybe someone who doesn't know a lot of FIRST lingo or doesn't really understand how generally the most common outreach programs work. So team members, English teachers, new team members especially, are great resources. And it also gives your new team members an opportunity to learn about your team. All right, executive summary. So the way we treat our executive summary is like, with a 500 characters per question, it's just like, you can barely fit anything. So you're sending in numbers and numbers and numbers. So here are some examples of the kind of things we can put in. Executive summary, like it's a summary for a reason. You just want to put in pretty much everything you can possibly put. Like whatever you leave out of the essay and executive summary, and sometimes the presentation, like no one will know about it. So you might as well put it in. So you want all your numbers, you want short paragraphs, not too many words. Some teams go for bullet points and some teams go for like short paragraphs. It's totally up to you. One thing we found is bullet points don't really work in terms of STIMS formatting. Like you can't make a new line. So it's more like dash info. But that's totally okay if you want to go for that. Grammar is not required because sometimes grammar takes characters and you don't really have a lot of them. So these are also examples of how you can shorten things to still a completely understandable method, but you're saving a lot of characters when you're writing that. So yeah, include all the data. You can think of it, add it, and nothing doesn't belong in the executive summary because there's that really helpful question like, is there anything else you want to add? And oh boy, yes, there is.
So the presentation is the first part of your actual one-on-one interaction with the judges. So for people who aren't familiar with how the presentation works, you have 7 minutes, and the clock starts the second you walk in the room. So you walk in the room, and the judges will start a timer on their phone. You can introduce yourselves. You can just start, and sometimes they will say hi, how are you, what's your name, and then they'll start the timer. You can't count on that. So when you're creating your presentation, what we tend to do is we try to have a limit of 6 minutes and 30 seconds in case that we get the judges where we walk in the room and they start the timer right then, even when we're like shaking hands and introducing ourselves. Most judges we found will wait a little bit and say like, are you ready? Are you good? And then they'll start the timer. Some won't. You just have to prepare for that sort of scenario. So this is sort of the story of your team. So you're using people, you're using your team members to tell it. So you want this to be personal. You don't just want this to be, team members stand up there and recite a memorized, shortened version of your essay or executive summary. They've already read your essay and executive summary. They should know that information. You can touch upon it again. You can sort of reiterate, especially if you have very large programs or impacts that you want the judges to remember. But you shouldn't, be repeating verbatim what you've already told them. So you need to figure out what format fits your data and story. Some teams go for a formal presentation, sort of like this. Some teams go for something more, it's like what Libby said earlier, or gimmicky, but less as gimmicky, more that they're using a specific format to tell their story. So we've heard of people, I think we did this once. We put our team on trial for being a role model team, and it was like a courtroom case. We've done a storybook theme where our presenters wrote and memorized like a short rhyming story, kind of like Dr. Seussish, and we had a storybook prop to go along with it. We tend to do, in recent years, a more formal presentation, just because we find that that's the easiest way to get our message across, and that when our team goes for using sort of metaphors like that, we often get lost in the metaphor. We get too carried away with it. We spend too much time focusing on the metaphor and not enough time focusing on our team and our team's impact and why we're a role model team. That being said, this like sort of themes like that can be a really great way to get judges engaged in your presentation. So they're definitely something to consider. Just don't get lost in it. For your presenters, make sure that you choose people on your team who can speak clearly and concisely. One thing that we do is we actually write our entire script beforehand and have our presenters memorize it like to the word and have them practice it multiple times beforehand, like hundreds of times beforehand, so that they know exactly what they're going to say before they go into the room. We find that this helps with nerves. They don't have to think of what they're trying to say before they go in the room or while they're in the room. They already know what they're going to say and exactly how they're going to say it. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. There's no deadline for the presentation. So if you win a regional chairman's award, say week 2, and then that qualifies you to go to championships and present for the championship chairman's award, you don't need to have the exact same presentation in the RCA regional that you have in the championships. So if you have, something that you want to add or some focus that you want to shift between the regional and the championships, you can absolutely do that. You can write an entirely new presentation. They're not going to know. It's not going to be the same judges. And even if it is the same judges, they might appreciate seeing that you're putting time and effort into sort of revamping your presentation and including new information. One thing that this can sort of apply to is if you're at a regional level, especially if you're presenting at a home regional, you might want to focus more on your community impact, what you've done for your local community. If you're going to Houston or Detroit, you might want to focus more on what you've done for FIRST as an organization, or FIRST as an international community rather than your more local one. For your presentation team, make sure you choose them well ahead of time. We chose our presenters a couple weeks ago. We haven't always done this. Last year, we chose them in January, and it was really, really rough, especially for me as a presenter, to write the entire presentation and get ourselves up to speed in a shorter time frame than we were used to. So the earlier you choose your presenters, the better. You can they have more time to write the presentation, they have more time to practice the presentation, they have more time to learn all the information they need to learn, and they have more time to practice questions, which we're going to talk about right now. Also, having a backup presenter can be really useful. So 3 presenters and 1 adult mentor can go into the room. The adult mentor is not allowed to talk. They have to sit in the back and they can watch the presentation. But the 3 students are going to be the only ones who are actually presenting and giving information. Having a backup just sort of gives you a little extra wiggle room in case a student gets sick, they have a family complication. For whatever reason, if you're one of your original 3 presenters cannot present that day, having a backup is just a safety net to make sure that that you're not going to be left with 2 presenters, or 2 presenters and somebody who has to walk in and say, sorry, I'm going to read off my phone or off of a paper that I have in front of me. It's just a good safety net.
Yeah, and the one thing I want to add is it's really important that your presenters are speaking, not reciting. It's a lot, because when you're in your presentation, it's your only face-to-face time with the judge. So you really want to try to connect on a more personal level. So if you're just standing there we are Team 1678, we are very impactful for this reason and this reason and this reason, you really want them to be a lot more personable and memorable than just they're reading a list in their mind.
So in the presentation, you can have 1 prop there with you. There is no sort of limit to what you can have as your prop. The one limit that's not actually official is it has to be able to fit through the door to the presentation room. So you can't have a behemoth TV screen that's rolled in behind you and playing some jazzy tune as your presenters are walking in. It's going to be a normal sized door, and it needs to fit through that normal sized door. That being said, that's pretty much the only limitation that you have. So we've done a variety of different things. I mentioned that we did the courtroom case earlier. We did the storybook that I said. The first year that we won in 2018, we actually had our theme was the 3 pillars of our team, which was educate, empower, and excel. And we had 3 large pillars made out of cardboard that we had spray painted to look like concrete, and then we had sort of decorated them with the names of the sort of programs and how we wanted to do that. So that was a very visual prop. This year we did a sort of a big magnetic board. You can sort of see right here. We had a whole bunch of graphs, pictures, logos for our different programs on them. We actually had them all covered up at the beginning. So at the beginning, it looked like a blank board that just had our logo and then our team's motto. And then as we spoke about programs in the presentation, the presenter would pull off the cover for the program. So the idea behind that was to draw the judge's attention to whatever we were speaking about in that moment, because it would be whatever had just been revealed. And then at the end, going from a sort of blank canvas to a pretty cluttered visual of different things that we've done with our program, and then we could reference back to that when the judges were asking us questions. One thing that you can do with your prop, if you're doing something sort of like this, where you're having graphics and graphs and pictures and data points all sort of displayed, we recommend that you just have them all visual at the end. That way, if the judge is like, oh, I saw this graph when you were talking about your summer camps, and can you go back to that? Can you tell me more about that? It's a good jumping off point for them to remember, oh yeah, I remember when they were talking about, XYZ program or this particular alumni who was very impactful to their community. So having that sort of jumping off point visual for the judges can be very useful to them, and then it's useful to you because you get to control what information they're seeing. So if you want them to ask questions about specific programs, you can visually draw their eyes to certain programs. Yeah. And then one more thing about presenting yourself. We find that presenting yourself as sort of your team believes is best will be best. So there's no one right way to present yourself. Some teams go up in just like their normal work shirts and maybe jeans or khakis, formal pants. Some teams have like polos with their team's logo on it or dress shirts. Some teams, was what we did one year, was we had sort of a dress outfit, but then our ties were all lime green because that's our color. I've also seen teams who their dress outfit is designed to look like their team. So if your team is like red and black, you might have like one presenter might have like a red shirt and black pants, one might have like a red cardigan and black pants, and one might have black pants and a red tie and a black shirt. I've seen that before. So there's no one right way to present yourself. The one thing that we do recommend is that you have to look clean and professional. So if your students who are presenters are also students who are working in the pits or they have some other job at competition, make sure that they take a little bit of time beforehand to brush their hair, make sure there's nothing in their teeth, maybe change their shoes to not have scuff marks, make sure that their pants aren't covered in grease, stuff like that. Even if you're not dressing in a formal way, if you're doing like your jeans and your team's shirt, which is perfectly fine, make sure that they look put together and not like you just like drag them in from the mud pit. Because making sure that you're clean will just leave a good impression on the judges subconsciously. Yeah, do you want me to talk about this one?
Yeah.
So the question session is the second half of where you get to interact with the judges. This is 5 minutes long, and it starts directly after they stop the timer for your presentation. So it's not that you have 12 minutes for the entire thing, and whatever you don't use for your presentation, you can use for your questions, or whatever you don't use for your questions, you can use for your presentation. You have exactly 5 minutes. And there's no run-up. If your presentation is 6 minutes long, you still get 5 minutes for questions. So this is going to come, like I said, this is going to come after your presentation. So at this point, they will have read your executive summary, they will have read your essay, and they will have heard the presentation and seen the prop that you just presented to them. So they should have all of the information at this point that you have given them. And now it's their turn to ask you questions about your program. We think that this is one of the most important parts of the chairman's submission, if you will, because it's the part that you can't control directly. You can control everything about the presentation and everything about the written submission. You cannot control what questions the judges ask your students in the judging room. So to do that, what you can control is how prepared your students are. And this is one of the reasons that choosing a presentation team or having a presentation team decided early is so important, is so that they can drill questions over and over and over. So you want to make sure that you are reiterating the strong points of your program that you decided on earlier on the first slide. When you're organizing everything, you decided, this is our most impactful program. This is what we want to leave the judges with. You need to make sure that the students know that and that they can tie back their answers, no matter what the answer is, to that sort of idea. So another thing that sort of going down to the third point, there are sort of 3 ways to answer questions. If a judge asks a question that you think, maybe this isn't the most important question to you for some reason, it's not what you want to highlight. So if a judge asks, how many students are on your team? And you really want to talk about everything that you've done with your youth robotics, you can answer, and you can't think of a way to sort of segue from, how many students are on your team to youth robotics without going through some convoluted path. you can very quickly answer 100 students or 50 students or 25 students, however many students are on your team, and then move on. You can also elaborate on that. So if this is a point of pride for your team, say maybe you're a low income team, but you managed to get 50 students on your team, and all 50 of those students are now planning on going to college where they might not have been before. That's huge. That's something that you really want to emphasize, and that's something you've decided you want to emphasize. So you don't have to just answer, we have 50 students. You can elaborate on that. What's your team structure like? What are you doing for those students? They're going to college now and they wouldn't have before. That's something that you definitely want to have as a presentation point. And this sort of leads into the idea of priority topics. So way before we go into the presentation room, about the time when we start practicing questions with our presentation team, we assign everybody priority topics. So this can be an outreach program, it can be sort of an idea about our team, like team structure, or it can just be like you're going to take all of the questions about about competition, about your team's competitive success, if the judge asks any questions about that. So a priority topic is something that student has to answer before they leave the room. So that there is say information that you saved specifically for the question and answer session because you think it will really, really wow the judges if you're able to answer one of their questions with this super stunning data point that you've pulled up. But you don't know what the judges are going to ask. So you need to make sure that the students know what to answer, even if you don't know what the judges are going to ask. And so giving them priority topics ahead of time really helps with that. And then making sure that they know how to sort of direct questions that might not be directly about, tell me about XYZ program. And that's one of their priority programs. If it's a more vague question like, how are you guys a role model team? That they can direct how are you a role model team back to this program that they need to talk about before they leave the room. So if you're doing question and answer sessions with your presentation team and giving them that 5-minute timer to answer any questions, make sure that they are touching upon those priority topics and that priority information before that 5 minutes is up. And you can also just give a simple and clear answer. This is sort of tying back to answering quickly and moving on. You don't want to avoid any of the judges' questions, even if it's something you directly don't want to talk about. But if you just want to keep it short and sweet, you absolutely can do that. If the judges want to know more information, they'll ask a follow-up question, and you can build off that. So practice makes better, not perfect. No one can ever be perfect at answering questions. I've been doing it for 2 years, and I'm absolutely not perfect. And I mess up all the time. So practice just will definitely make you a lot better, but you're still going to trip up. That's just something that the students are going to need to work on. One tip for the Q&A session that I found really helpful over the years is that if a judge asks a question that you don't understand or you don't know how to answer or you just need more time to think about your answer in your head, you can just say, oh, can you rephrase that? Or can you rephrase that last question? Sorry. And then them rephrasing that question, even if you perfectly understood it, gives you a little bit more time to think about how you want to respond. Or if you didn't understand it, if them rephrasing it will hopefully put it in a light that, okay, now I understand what they're trying to ask me. And now I understand what kind of information that I want to give in response to that. So you don't have to, just stand there like a stone thinking like, I don't know what they said and I don't know how to respond. You can ask the judges if they can, rephrase that or what do you mean by that? Or were you referring to this? That kind of thing is absolutely okay.
Awesome. So that was all of the components of the chairman's submission, sort of the way we see it. So I'm just going to go over some of the other hidden benefits of chairman's because we found sometimes in the past our chairman's team works in a bubble a little bit, but chairman should be a full team activity and it's something that the entire team can benefit from. So especially as you keep writing chairman submissions over the years, it's really great to look back on them and look at the growth of your team and see how far you've progressed. Because maybe your numbers don't seem that great to you, but if you look back, you can see how much you've grown. And your numbers don't have to be big, they just need to be growing, because that's showing that you're working, you're improving, and your impact is growing as you're going on. Some other things you can use your chairman's submission for that's really useful is gaining sponsors, and also sometimes applying for grants or presenting to like school board committees and that kind of thing. We've reused our presentation quite a few times when we're presenting to like a PTA or to a sponsor that we're trying to retain. And also the chairman's submission is conveniently a whole like amalgamation of all this incredible information about your team. That's basically like why you would want to sponsor us, like what you're going to get out of it, how awesome we are. So it's right there for you to use. You can shorten it or you can just send it into people. The other thing that is really great is new members when they join your team, especially if you have a lot of team history, it's kind of hard for them to absorb it. But your chairman's submission can be a great way for them to just look it over, to reference, to have some idea of what your team is about beyond us building a robot in our shop for 8 hours a day. And of course, as you're writing the chairman's submission, you're not building a robot, you're gaining soft skills, you're learning writing, you're learning communication, you're learning the ABCs, accuracy, brevity, and clarity. Oh yeah, it's epic. Sorry, that was really bad. But yeah, the chairman's award submission is a great way to learn some skills that are not like as heavily advertised in FIRST, but that are still really, really useful in the real world. Awesome. There's just a couple other things that we want to go over with. We've gained some like insight into how the award itself is judged at competitions and what the judges hear about and what they don't hear about. So let's just go over that right now. What we do know, what we think, of course, okay, no one is absolutely sure about this, but we're pretty sure that the chairman's judges do not go in the pits. So there are judges that come through the pits at regionals and ask your team questions about your robot and your outreach, but we're pretty sure the chairman's judges are always in the room and they won't be talking to your team. However, you should absolutely be making every effort to present yourself well to the judges and make sure they're receiving important information, because that information does trickle down through the other judges and can make its way to the chairman's award room. So definitely don't disregard the judges in the pits, but just know it probably won't be the chairman's judges in the pits.
An important part of this is making sure that you know, just because the judges in the pits aren't chairman's judges doesn't mean that they won't necessarily talk to them during breaks, in the break room, in the award room, etc. So if you or a representative of your team is rude or flippant to a judge, that will absolutely affect whether or not you can win a chairman's award. And it will affect whether or not you can qualify for other awards too. So keep that in mind. Always stay polite and professional at competition, especially to judges.
Mm-hmm. And just one thing to add, this, I think it's probably pretty clear, but the judges, they'll probably listen to all the presentations and then get together and talk about which team stood out the most. So this is where it's really important that you had your key things that you want the judges to remember, because at this point they probably have like an overload of information that they've been that has been delivered to them by all these high school students, and they're just trying to remember a few things. So you want them to have just a couple of key points under their belt that they can use when they're talking, who do we want to pick? And then your judge, who is really listening intently, says, oh, this team, I remember they did this and this and this, and they had numbers to back it up, and I really believe they are a really strong contender for the chairman's award. Because once you're gone, you need to have the judges vouch for you when they're discussing among themselves which team is this most standout team. They need to remember you. If they don't remember you, they're not going to choose you. Do you have anything else to add for judging?
Just don't give up on submitting. We submitted for 4 to 6 years. I can't count. A very long time before we won our first regional chairmans. So everybody on our team who had started had actually gone through the entire program and not won a regional chairman's award. So don't get discouraged. Your programs, if you don't think that your programs are enough, the best thing you can do is grow them in that year and keep pushing them. FIRST really likes to see growth. You don't need to have the best, the most, the most well-funded, the most international program. They want to see growth and they want to see sustainability. So if you had, not a whole lot of outreach this year and you absolutely exploded over the course of a year or 2 years, that makes you a very, very strong contender, even if you think, well, I'm not as good as this other team. The growth is really what's important.
Yeah, so that just connects back to like the other benefits of submitting for the Chairman's Award. You get a lot more out of it than maybe like a chance at a blue banner. Awesome. So now it is time for questions. Is this QR?
This QR is, I don't think
this QR does anything. If you do have, like, you think of some question in a couple days, you can email us. You can contact us through our website, which is citruscircus.org, and our email addresses and stuff are on there too. So you can email us if you want, but otherwise, have at it.
Oh, and one quick thing that we didn't mention during the presentation is that there's a fifth component, which is a video. The reason we didn't talk about it is that the judges actually shouldn't watch the video. The video is only played if you win at the award, and it's played after you win for the entire stadium to see. So the video is a required part of the submission. You do need to have a video. It can be up to 3 minutes, between 2 and 3 minutes long, but the judges shouldn't be watching it to decide whether or not you win. So your audience for that is going to be the other teams at the competition, basically showing them, like, who is this team? Like, why did they win? Like, what makes them a role model team that we should look to emulate? So, but the judges, unless maybe it's a really, really close match between you and another team, should not watch the video to judge your submission. So there is a sort of fifth component, but we didn't talk about it because the judges aren't looking at it, or shouldn't be.
Awesome. Yeah.
How do you guys handle the fact that there's all those short questions? And how do you keep yourselves from repeating the information from there into your long essay?
Yeah, so the executive summary is 12 questions, 500 characters each. And I think it is definitely something that our team struggles with. What we have done in the past is we figure out, because each question is sort of worded slightly differently, like you can tell some of them, they're trying to figure out how many first teams you started, they're trying to figure out how many FRC teams you started, they're trying to tell how you're promoting diversity. And so when we're putting in the data for that question, we're using data points that specifically target the answer to those questions. To make sure that we're not repeating ourselves, we do go over it a lot. And it also really helps to have, like I mentioned earlier, that spreadsheet of all the information to make sure you're not forced to repeat things. If you are, that there's nothing you've left out or forgotten. And that's also why sometimes bullet points are really helpful, because you can fit all the information in. Whereas if you have paragraphs, maybe if you have less information, you can sort of explain things more and shed light more on their impact. So it's just a matter of like reviewing it pretty frequently.
I mean, if you are afraid about like not having enough data to fill up like all of the executive summary questions and then have completely different data for your essay, have what we think would probably be most helpful, and what we do sometimes is having as much data as you possibly can in the executive summary. Any other data points that don't fit, you can put in your in your essay, in your presentation, maybe slip it into a question somewhere. But you can highlight the important bits back over in your presentation. So, I mean, if the judges read a number once, they're probably not going to remember it. If they read it twice or maybe 3 times, some judges might think it's repetitive. Some judges are going to remember that and use that as a reason to fight for you. So if 100% of your alumni have gone to college or into the workforce in STEM fields, and that's something you really want to highlight, you can say that under the question that's what program has what impact has your program had on its students. You can repeat it in your essay, and you can mention it again briefly in your presentation if that you think is a really, really core part of your team's experience.
Does anyone else have any questions?
How big is your group that works on that committee?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So we have. Oh gosh, I actually don't know.
I think it's like 12.
So we have 12 students, a couple of mentors, not including people that we send our essay to. But these people aren't the people who work on our outreach. This is just chairmans. Our team is set up a little bit differently. So chairmans is actually categorized as like a secondary sub-team, which just means that students from our other sub-teams, so technical sub-teams, our business media sub-team, our like software scouting and programming sub-teams, can all join chairmen, and it meets at a separate time than the other, like than the general team and the regular sub-team meetings. So the idea behind this is that we want to get people involved from chairmen from technical and non-technical backgrounds. So, we want some of the writing skills from like our business and media team, but we also want the sort of unique perspective that maybe somebody on the programming sub-team would bring that, somebody on the business team might not think of. And then because of this, all of the students who work on our outreach, so our outreach leads, we have an outreach lead for each program, don't have to be in chairmans. Some of them are, and some of them do work with chairmans, and all of them work closely with chairmans to sort of get data together, but not all of them are part of the chairman sub-team. So we make it optional and open to all students so that we can get a bunch of different perspectives.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add really fast is it's a pretty small group who's working on the submission itself, but we try to regard the Chairman's Award as a whole as a full team endeavor, because we wouldn't have any of the information or the proof of why we're a role model team to win the Chairman's Award if we didn't have every single one of our students participating in and supporting our outreach activities. So we try to make sure everyone on the team is aware of what Chairman's is doing, why the outreach that they're doing is important. So we share information about the Chairman's meetings that we have at our beginning of team meetings, just so everyone is aware of the sub-team's work.
There's a question on the chat that says, how should teams that don't do big outreach things like starting teams go about showing the outreach we do?
I think frame it in the context of your team. So if you're a smaller team, maybe you have 10 to 15 students, and you're still doing outreach in addition to competition, that's really, really important. If you clearly, you don't have, the manpower, the physical resources to, easily, start a bunch of teams or, mentor, a bunch of teams or whatever, but you're still working very hard and you have a bunch of members that are very committed to community outreach, that's important, and that's something that you want to showcase. So remember that you can frame your submission in the context of your own team, as long as you tell the judges what the context of your team is. If you don't tell the judges that, maybe you come from a lower income community, you're a newer team, you don't have that many students, or you had some, maybe your team split into two, so you're having trouble getting back on your feet. If you don't tell them that, they're not going to know it. So if you tell them that and frame your submission in sort of how your team operates and the parameters that your team can operate, that will make your team seem a lot more impressive, even if you don't, start a bunch of teams, do things internationally, et cetera.
Yeah, and it's also, especially being a smaller team or your numbers, like you're comparing yourselves a lot, it's a great place to emphasize your growth. Like maybe you don't think you started that many teams, but you've been steadily growing more and more. That's an indicator that your success will continue and you're a very sustainable program. So the numbers don't necessarily have to be big, they gotta be high quality.
Are there any other questions?
Do you require everyone on your team to do outreach?
We do. We have minimum outreach requirements. So we have a youth robotics program that we run. So every student has to volunteer at a competition. Every student has to volunteer to run a booth that we run at our farmers market at least once. And students are also required to either be a summer camp counselor or a mentor for one of our youth robotics teams. So we do have certain outreach requirements. Most students, or I think most students who get involved with the team, who get very involved with the team, want to do more outreach than just that. So our outreach is pretty dependent on our students and our students' sort of passion for it. But yeah, we do have minimum outreach requirements. Thank you. Oh, yes.
No, I haven't got a question, but I've got a comment. Not about your presentation. It was awesome.
Thanks, Harvey.
But-
This is our lead mentor. He came to judge us.
I came because I knew it'd be a great presentation.
Aww.
So, I was watching the presidential debates with my wife, and I know she sent you a little message about it, but I would just tell everyone that if you want to see people that can take a question and twist it around to say exactly what they want to say, then you should watch the presidential debates, because those people are masters at making sure they get their message through to their audience, which is the voting public, right? Not the judges in this case, but they're asked questions and sometimes they completely avoid the question, which I don't think is a good idea in a chairman's situation. But sometimes they'll take the question, they kind of tweak it around and say it in a way, and they'll answer it in a way that really shows the audience what they want to have them hear. So it's just a great example.
Just like that, there are plenty of great examples of things that can be applied to chairmen that aren't necessarily chairman specific. We watch a lot of Nike ads to learn to figure out how we want to do. Yeah, we still have to bring them.
Give away part of my presentation.
Oh, sorry. Go to the outreach presentation tomorrow. It'll be really good. But we watch a lot of those high quality dramatic advertisements with the gorgeous shots that leave your heart pounding a little bit. That's sort of how we want to leave people after having watched our video, which isn't a formal part of the submission, but it's a really good way to show the FRC community why you deserve this award that you got at this particular event. So it can also help you with your presentation and how to frame things. If they're saying something in this particular way in this advertisement to elicit a certain emotional response, you can mimic that somewhat in your presentation or in your questions. So you can sort of frame your sentences like they're framing theirs.
All right, so I think we're good with questions. So you guys absolutely free to leave, but feel free to come up to us, ask us any more questions. Also, I think both of us are going to be here all weekend, either in our pit or just wandering around. So feel free to come up and talk to us or contact us through our website, like I said. But thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it.